Hello and welcome. Today we'll dive into the .NET Entity Framework, a very popular and powerful object relational mapping tool. It allows developers to work with data as objects and properties, hiding much of their complex SQL tasks. Let's get started, shall we? Let's create a new console application project. In the project templates, we'll choose Console App. Let's name it EF Intro. We're going to start without an actual database. Entity Framework fully supports it and it can be useful for quick tests. So instead of a database, we're just going to save everything in memory. To get started with Entity Framework, we need to install it from the NuGet Package Manager. And since we're starting with an in-memory database, we look for the Entity Framework core.inmemory. Here it is, let's install it. And of course, we can see that this package depends on the Entity Framework core package and a bunch of additional packages. Okay, we're ready to start writing our code. First, let's define our model. The model is a C# representation of a database table. And once we move to an actual database, a suitable table will actually be created in the database. By convention, we should place this class in a folder called Models. In this folder, I'll create a class for the model itself. For simplicity, I'll just call this class Item. And let's start with a single property in this class, and it's going to be the name of the item. I would like you to notice two things. First is that I used a property rather than a field. This is what's expected when using Entity Framework, and that's what you should use. The other thing is that I used a nullable string. This will allow the value to be null in the database table itself. Another property that every model that we're going to use with Entity Framework must have is the ID property. As you can see, for its type I chose int, but it can also be a string. As for its name, it has to be either ID, as I wrote, or it can be item ID. Now, if the name of the class was not item, but anything else, this alternative name would have been different as well. So it can be either ID or the name of the class followed by ID. The next thing we'll do is create the data folder. Data is the name of the folder that's usually used to hold the database context class. The database context is basically the class that's in charge of connecting to the database itself, which we'll call memory context. And this name will help us remember that we're not really using an external database, but we use memory instead. Now, since we want to use this class as a database context, it has to inherit from DB context. And of course, the using for the Entity Framework was added. Inside our database context class, we're going to place our DB sets. Each DB set represents a table in our database. Let's start with one DB set to represent the item table. One more thing to do in our database context is to override the onConfiguring method. This is needed to specify the database provider that will be used. In our case, we use in-memory database, so that's how we'll configure the database context. Now that we have our database context, we can add items to our database and then read them from the database. We'll do that in our main program. When working with database contexts, we always have to make sure that we dispose them once we're done. One way to do it is by declaring the database context in a wrapping using. Let's add a few items to our database. As you can see, I added the items directly to the database. I could add them to the items DB set, but I can also omit it, as I did, and it will result in the same thing. That's because Entity Framework can infer to which DB set the new object needs to be added to, according to its type. To commit the changes to the database, we need to call save changes. And now that we have a few items in our database, we can retrieve them from the database. Notice that items returns a DB set, so we had to use toList to convert it to a list. And let's display the items that we retrieved from the database to the console.